Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're diving into essentially how to hack motivation so you can crush your goals, whether that be physique related or business related. And this has made a pretty profound difference on my ability to stay motivated and optimize my productivity. So let's get into it by first going over one of the most fundamental molecules that drives human behavior. That is none other than dopamine. So we're going to break down how dopamine controls motivation, focus, goal directed behavior, and even your baseline sense of satisfaction. We're also going to explore how your brain uses dopamine to prioritize what matters, how to avoid burnout, and how to stay locked in for extended periods of time. So, we're going to be going over essentially what dopamine really is and how it functions in the brain very briefly. Then, why motivation isn't just about how much willpower you have, but how it's about biology, how to increase your drive without burning out and overdoing it. Then, the science behind effort based rewards and how to train your brain to love hard work. Then, we'll end off with some evidence based protocols, supplements, and lifestyle tools to boost your level of dopamine. So, if you've ever struggled to stay consistent, felt like your motivation comes in waves, in and out, or found yourself addicted to short term pleasure at the cost of long term progress, this episode is going to change the way you approach everything from your training and your work to your daily habits and mental performance as well. So, to give you a little bit of a background, dopamine, which most people think about as like the pleasure molecule, but in reality, dopamine is far more about pursuit than it is about pleasure. It's what gets you off the couch and into the gym. It's what fuels, let's say, getting up early to chase your goals, that hour early just to get your cardio in or meal prep. So it's a neuromodulator, not just a neurotransmitter. So this means that instead of simply sending messages from one neuron to another, dopamine actually alters the likelihood that certain networks of neurons will fire. So, in other words, it changes the probability of action, which means dopamine directly impacts your behavior. So, there are two primary dopamine circuits in the brain. One governs movement, which is why dopamine depletion causes motor unit dysfunction in conditions like Parkinson's, for example. And the other controls reward, motivation, and reinforcement, which involves your prefrontal cortex responsible for planning and decision making, and the nucleus, your reward and motivation center. Now, dopamine doesn't just spike when you get reward, it spikes in the pursuit of reward. So your brain releases dopamine when you're in action, when you're seeking something you value. The more dopamine you have during that pursuit, the more motivated and driven you feel. Now, an insight I learned from Dr. Huberman that I found pretty profound is your sense of motivation and satisfaction isn't determined by your absolute dopamine level. It's governed by changes in your dopamine relative to your recent baseline. So that means how motivated you feel right now is largely dependent on what your dopamine was doing like 30 minutes ago, or yesterday, or last week. And that's why stacking quick dopamine hits. So scrolling on TikTok, then eating a bunch of sugar, processed foods, then binge watching content, that leaves you feeling flat and unmotivated later. And this is why starting your day off with that easy, cheap dopamine, like waking up immediately, going right to your phone, starting to scroll, terrible way to start your day. So, dopamine essentially operates like a seesaw. You have a baseline, your resting level, we could call it, and then you have spikes and peaks, which occur when something rewarding happens. But after every peak, dopamine then drops, and not just back to baseline, it often dips below baseline. And that dip is what makes you feel then unmotivated, tired, and even depressed after doing something highly pleasurable. It's not necessarily that the experience itself was bad, it's that the crash was almost inevitable. So, if you're constantly chasing high dopamine experiences, whether it's as simple as like high stim pre workouts or junk food, social media, or even just endless mental masturbation, watching business content as an example for hours, which is what I did like 2 years ago. I wasn't actually taking any action, but I was getting that dopamine kick from learning and never applying anything. Just watching the next Alex Hormoza video, the next Danco, the next Modern Wisdom podcast, and you're basically training your brain to kind of expect those big spikes. And the more spikes you get, the lower your baseline then becomes, and eventually, nothing feels rewarding, which is the road to burnout. Or in extreme cases, can potentially lead to addiction. But this system is actually trainable, which is the good news. The key lies in learning how to manage your dopamine peaks intermittently so that your baseline remains stable or even increases over time. And the most powerful way to do that is to learn how to derive dopamine from effort itself. Because if dopamine spikes in pursuit, then what happens when you start to enjoy the pursuit itself? Well, that's when everything changes. You flip the script in a way. Instead of delaying gratification only for the reward at the end, you teach your brain to find reward in the process. So, becoming process oriented or cultivating a growth mindset is essentially what we're after, because when you train yourself to enjoy the discomfort, the grind, you basically unlock a sustainable source of dopamine. You become someone who thrives on challenge, essentially. So, what I do personally to put this into practice is say the following phrase: "This is what I want." That's the phrase. Whenever I'm in moments of greatest resistance, this could be in the gym, this could be business, during cold exposure, when I cold plunge in the morning, I frame the hard thing as the reward. And what happens over time, after you do this time and time again, your brain will start to associate dopamine with the effort, not just the outcome. And that's how you stay motivated even when the results are delayed, which, if you're after any type of goal, they are always are. So you don't hit the gym one day, wake up with your dream physique. You don't start a business and the next day selling for multi-millions of dollars. So once you've taken that framework on board, we can now put into practice some tools to support this process. So first, let's start with some lifestyle protocols. Honestly, the big needle movers. Number one being cold exposure. Studies show that cold water immersion can increase dopamine by up to 2.5x baseline and keep it elevated for I believe it's 3 hours. Correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free to in the comments, but I believe it's 2.5x in dopamine over 3 hours, maybe 2.5 hours as well. So you can, if you can get 1 to 3 sessions in the morning, ideally definitely away from your resistance training if your goal is to build muscle, because you don't want to blunt that inflammatory response. The worst thing you can do if the goal is to build muscle is to cold plunge after your workout. So anytime other than after your workout, you're pretty much chilling. Second, intermittent novelty and detox. So most people run into dopamine issues not because the brain stops producing it at adequate levels, but because they keep hammering away the same reward pathways over and over. And when you repeat the same dopamine rewarding activities on a day-to-day basis, like the same music playlist, the same caffeine timing, the same doom scroll, the receptors can actually begin to downregulate, and your brain essentially gets kind of numb to the stimulus. So, we want to apply some novelty just by rotating the stimulus, like maybe switching up your caffeine source, maybe going coffee to tea to nothing, or even varying what you listen to. Podcast one day, nothing the next. Give yourself your certain nervous system a break, or audiobooks. Then layered on top of that is the concept of intermittently detoxing. So just like intermittent fasting gives your digestive system a break, intermittently detoxing gives your dopamine system essentially some breathing room. And that could look like having caffeine off days, maybe on your rest day, once or twice a week, so adenosine receptors reset. For example, I'll take a rest day or two off caffeine maybe every 3 weeks, which is not much, but I do love my caffeine. This one's a little harder. I haven't personally done the whole 9 days to reset my adenosine receptors, but I'm waiting for December when I go on vacation to give this a try. And that is also a time I'm going to try a social media detox, or something I do every Sunday is what I call low dopamine mornings. So no phone, which I never do, to be fair, no music or podcast, and no stimulants until after I've done my most important work. Now, after those, I need to mention, to hack dopamine, we need high quality sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation destroys dopamine receptor sensitivity. So getting 7 to 9 hours per night and optimizing that sleep, which I've done many podcasts on that before, won't go too deep in it on this one, is a non-negotiable. So once those lifestyle habits are in place, now we can biohack a little, take this up a notch, take it to the next level via supplementation. First being L-tyrosine, the precursor to dopamine, which doses of 500 to 2,000 milligrams taken 30 minutes before like any mentally demanding task will and can increase drive and focus. Then we have uridine monophosphate, which supports dopamine signaling and plasticity. So you can use it in conjunction with L-tyrosine for synergistic effects. Then we have B6, B9, iron, omega-3s as well to support dopamine synthesis as well as receptor health. Especially if you're deficient in any one of those, that will be a rate limiting factor on your dopamine. And I like saffron extract as well, more specifically for mood in the morning, but it can also somewhat increase motivation. So with that stack, along with everything we went through beforehand, you will be hacking dopamine and will be absurdly locked in toward whatever task or pursuit you're after. But we do want to avoid some things to ensure we're staying motivated and not going backwards or hindering these lifestyle habits and supplementation. First, that's got to go is mindless scrolling. Actually, it doesn't have to go, but it has to be managed. Every scroll is a dopamine hit, but it's easy dopamine. You've had to do nothing for it, and it trains your brain to expect reward without any effort. Next is highly palatable foods like ultra processed foods, which spike dopamine far more than natural foods. So the more unhealthy, essentially, your diet is, the less rewarding normal food and normal life can actually feel. And lastly, this one is huge for productivity in getting into a flow state specifically. You want to avoid constant multitasking. So splitting your attention, not optimal for your dopamine system because your brain becomes addicted to that novelty and stimulation, thus making deep focus, what we want, nearly impossible. So that is a wrap on today's episode. We went over exactly how to hack motivation, more specifically dopamine, so you can get after your goals in the most optimal way possible. If you want 30 days of free advice, tips that will fast track your ability to build muscle, drop body fat, have more energy, optimize your health, you'll get a free training plan, your exact macros set up for you, and more to transform your physique. You can click the first link in the description. And for coaching, as well as my discount codes on the supplements I use, those are also linked in the description as well. I appreciate you for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.